What is up, guys, and welcome to another episode of the Equestrian Physio on Air. I'm going to do a quick one here because I am just on my way to work, and I apparently am just getting in this habit of throwing a mic on me when I'm driving and riffing when an idea comes into my head. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about asymmetries, and when do we care about them, and when do we not? So without further ado, not going to bury the lead here. Let's roll the tape. Hey, I'm Katie. I'm a physiotherapist, strength and conditioning coach, and lifelong rider dedicated to helping equestrians build strong, capable, resilient bodies, both in and out of the saddle. This podcast is here to empower riders of all levels with evidence-informed rehab, training, and education. And we're not just here to follow tradition for tradition's sake. We're here to challenge outdated norms and bring critical thinking and curiosity to how we train, ride, and show up. Let's get into it. So, asymmetries. This is something that I think equestrians are a little bit obsessive, maybe the word, I don't know, but they're very, very concerned about the level of symmetry and handedness and, crookedness and whether their spine is in alignment and all of these things. And from what I tend to see, a lot of equestrians, a lot of people that I work with in general, really tend to get bogged down in trying to find the best quote unquote corrective or quote unquote, passive therapy as well to try and fix their asymmetry. They're trying to find the thing that will unscrew their twistedness, that will, pop their joints back into place, that will make their legs the same length, all of the above. Now, when I discuss asymmetry, handedness, those kinds of things in most athletes, I actually don't really give a shit. I don't care if an athlete has handedness, has a sidedness, especially if it's within the realm of maybe 10, 15% of, one side versus the other. Because odds are it's not a problem. Odds are it's within that realm of normal. Odds are, especially if they're an athlete that's, operating in almost any sport, it's actually advantageous, right? If you have a golfer in front of you, for example, I had a varsity level golfer that I was treating last year for some hip stuff, and his one hip had an excessive amount of internal rotation, right? His leading leg when he is swinging, and his back hip had an excessive amount of external rotation, and his front hip actually had really shitty external rotation, and his back hip had really shitty external rotation. And other way around. Yes, his front hip had shitty external rotation, his back hip had shitty internal rotation. Because guess what? Having that rotational pattern was advantageous to his golf swing. That was something that he had developed. It didn't really affect him in his day-to-day life because he never really had to go into those extremes of ranges. And so in his normal walking, running, things in a linear pattern, it never became a problem. And when he was playing golf, it was advantageous. So yes, when I assessed him, it took a second for me to just realize what was happening and go, oh, wait, no, this actually isn't a problem. But it's still something that a lot of people would start to be like, oh, well, that's going to cause a hip imbalance, and that's going to cause, a shift in your pelvis, or this or that, or that's going to cause chronic problems up the road. Realistically, no. Humans are amazingly adaptable. We can adapt to a lot of things. If we couldn't, imagine para-athletes, for example. They have, a lot of the time, the epitome of an asymmetry. And so it's pretty common to see para-athletes. I'm not saying they don't have pain. I'm not saying they don't have issues, but they can adapt and they can still compete and they can still create force and do things, even missing an entire limb, right? So having a little bit of a leg length discrepancy, for example, having a little bit of a handedness is not necessarily a bad thing. And as I said, for most athletes, whether it's soccer, whether it's baseball, whether it's volleyball, whether it's golf, any of them really, snowboarding even, having an asymmetry is not necessarily a bad thing. And in a lot of cases, it's probably advantageous. Now, bringing that back to equestrians, it's not quite so simple. And I kind of, speak a different, or have a bit of a different tune when we're talking about equestrians because ours isn't the only body in the equation, right? If it was just an athlete, a soccer player and his ball, a snowboarder and her board, the asymmetry doesn't really matter because their body can adapt to that and function just fine, and it's never going to be a problem. In riders, though, if we have a significant dominance, if we have a significant mobility restriction, especially because we are operating at very extremes of mobility when we're on a horse usually, we have to like spread our legs around them, that is where these asymmetries potentially can become a little bit more of an issue, or at least are a little bit more worth addressing. So I have a lot of riders come to me and they're like, okay, but how do I fix that? How do I fix this? Leg length discrepancy is a big one that I find a lot of riders are told. A lot of chiropractors or doctors will say, like, you have a leg length discrepancy. Again, please don't change your stirrup length because someone told you have a leg length discrepancy. Stirrup holes are about an inch apart. Most leg length discrepancies are a centimeter or less, and that's even if they're accurately measured. Our ability to accurately measure a leg length discrepancy in a clinical scenario is abominably poor. Like, the measurement test that we use when that is like validated against MRIs that are actually like measuring your bone length in a very objective, clear way, it's shit. We're not very good at it. So anyway, needless to say, don't read too much into your leg length discrepancy unless you are actually wearing a lift in your shoe or having to hem your pants, because it's that obvious. Sidebar. However, coming back to other asymmetries with riders, I find when I chat with riders on social media, a lot of you guys are looking for a specific corrective exercise for your asymmetry. And I think that's the wrong way to go about it. Because if you're constantly chasing, okay, I need this asymmetry or this exercise to open up my right side, and then this exercise to work on my left hip rotation, and then this exercise to work on my right ankle mobility, it's a lot of playing whack-a-mole, and it's not necessarily a great way to go about kind of addressing your off-horse training, because one, you're gonna get bored, especially if you're not seeing results, and two, if we just apply a general, well-rounded strength training program to any rider, odds are a lot of that is gonna come out in the wash. So when I program for equestrians, I am always starting with a base of, what do you need as a human being? So you can go back to, I want to say episode 2, episode 3, I'll try and link it in the show notes, where I talk about like how I program and how I sort of strategically build one thing on top of another on top of another. And the base of that pyramid, the base of my programming for all riders is, what do you need as a human? What do you need to function? What do you need to kind of like stay strong enough in your life to still get yourself off the toilet at 95? That is the base. And that is typically the Canadian Activity Guidelines or the WHO Guidelines, which basically says you need 150 minutes of cardio activity per week, moderate to vigorous. Up to 300 minutes is definitely not a bad thing. And 2 strength training sessions, 2 resistance training sessions per week that are hitting all your major muscle groups and taking to a fairly high intensity, so taking fairly close to failure. That is the base of any program that I am writing for riders. And if I am, starting with someone who has never trained in their life, that is kind of the floor that we're trying to get to. Then the next step is I take that program and I start biasing towards someone's individual needs. So say someone is a Grand Prix dressage rider, I'm going to start to bias towards the needs of a Grand Prix dressage rider. So lots of hip mobility, lots of eccentric hip and leg work, lots of low back mobility to be able to absorb and handle and control the forces that are coming up from the horse as they're doing those big extended gaits, and lots of upper back strength, that kind of stuff. So I'm biasing, not replacing, just starting to bias the program towards those needs. The next layer that I add in is what someone needs as an individual. And this is where we start to build in, if any of you have done my symmetry screen, so the symmetry screen where you run through these different functional and mobility tests, if anyone has done that, that is where I start to build in those things that we find. So if someone has, say, a 20% strength difference between their left and their right leg, I am going to build in more unilateral work. I'm not going to build in more left leg work specifically. I'm just going to build in more unilateral work to address that. If someone has a lack of internal hip rotation on the left side, I am going to build in more hip rotation mobility, right? But again, not replacing that base program, just biasing these things. Now, another question that I often get from people is, should I be doing more on my weaker or on my less mobile side, right? If someone says, okay, my left leg is weaker, should I be doing more reps on my left side? The answer is no, unless you were coming back from a very specific injury. So the reason the answer is no is a couple, let me see if I can explain this well. A couple reasons. Okay, number one, your body does not know how many reps and what weight you're doing an exercise at. It doesn't know that. It's not responding to that. What your body is responding to is how close you are taking a certain muscle group to a failure point. That is kind of the gist of it, where, if you are 2 reps away from failure, you are going to have more stimulus put into that tissue group and drive more adaptation in that tissue than if you are 7 reps away from failure with doing an exercise. Does that make sense? So if we are doing, say, a calf raise with 20 pounds and you are doing 3 sets of 8, and that takes your left calf to 2 reps from failure. So, you're doing a set of 8. Theoretically, you could do 10 on that left side before you couldn't do an 11th. And on your right side, say your right side is a stronger side, and that is taking you only, 4 reps away from failure. So you do that 8 reps, you could theoretically do 12 before you couldn't do another one. Can you see how we don't necessarily need to do more on the left side in order to drive more adaptation? Because both legs doing the same weight and the same number of reps, so both legs, you are doing a 20-pound calf raise and you're doing 8 reps within a set, the left leg is 2 reps away from failure. So it is already getting that extra stimulus. It is already being pushed to a point where we are going to be driving more adaptation. The right leg, on the other hand, is 4 reps away from failure. So it's not getting as much stimulus. It is not being driven to adapt quite as much as the left side. And so can you see that over time, if you continued to do that same weight, same rep scheme on each side, one is closer to failure than the other, you are getting more stimulus on your weaker side already. You don't need to do more there because it's already getting that extra drive to adapt. And so eventually, hopefully that will even things out. So coming back to the overall big picture here, no, I don't think riders need to be doing as much seeking out of corrective exercises, seeking out of people trying to, quote unquote, fix their imbalances, as long as they are getting a well-rounded resistance training program that is, at the very least covering all their major muscle groups and taking them to that, higher intensity, close to failure level. And then ideally a little bit biased towards their discipline, their sport, and including unilateral work. Because a lot of these things, whether it is a dominance, whether it is a mobility issue on one side versus the other, those things will come out in the wash if you're just doing that well-rounded program. And so you don't necessarily need to include a bunch of corrective exercises to quote unquote fix an asymmetry. Caveat to that is if you are coming back from an actual injury or if you have like an actual chronic thing that you're dealing with. So for example, I had a client on the app this morning who I have actually worked with her in person. She had an ankle fracture. So a tib-fib fracture, boot top fracture, we call it, where, her ankle was basically shattered and she had to, develop, like she was in a boot for I think it was like 12 or 14 weeks. It was quite a long time. Non-weight bearing, immobilized. So obviously had a significant loss of range of motion and a significant loss of strength in that side. That is someone who is going to need more ankle exercises, more ankle mobility work than the average person, because odds are, especially as she's going through this acute sort of rehab phase, she's going to need more there to even herself out. She needs to give that side a little bit of a boost because of how far back she's starting from, essentially. But say we take that same person and say she's 5 years out from that ankle injury and she's been doing consistent resistance training for those 5 years. She probably doesn't need, even if she has a little bit of a weakness one side or the other, she probably doesn't need a lot of additional ankle work still, except for maybe if she has some lingering stiffness because of the metal plates that she has in her ankle. So anyway, for the average person who's not coming back from an injury, who's not, rehabbing from a surgery or mobilization or something like that, if you've just been told that you have an upslip on one side of your pelvis, that you have a torsion, that you have a leg length discrepancy, that even if you're in the saddle and you just have a dominant side, odds are if you just commit to doing a well-rounded resistance training program that's covering all your major muscle groups, covering all the mobility needs that you have specifically for your discipline, for your equestrian sport, and that is being done consistently, you don't need to seek out all these corrective exercises. If you think about that description that I have, I think in whatever it was, episode 2 or something, where I'm talking through how I do programming, I describe it as a pyramid, where the base of the pyramid is covering those activity guidelines, and then we're biasing towards you and your sport, and then we're biasing towards your individual needs, right? So like the impairments that you have, the weaknesses side to side, and then we're biasing towards your your specific, like any rehab needs. That's kind of the top of the pyramid. So the top 2 tiers of this pyramid are your individual needs and your rehab needs. And I find a lot of riders, one of the issues that they have is that they seek out the top of the pyramid. They seek to quote unquote correct things without actually having the bottom of the pyramid established. And so that's where I talk about a lot of these things coming out in the wash, and a lot of these things will self-correct or will get to the point where it's not actually a problem because you're just so strong overall that your asymmetry doesn't even matter anymore if we really work on that bottom of the pyramid. So that's my soapbox for today. Hope you guys enjoy. Anyway, please, if I can ask a little bit of a favor, share this with anyone that you think might benefit from it. If you can drop a little rating or review on whatever podcast platform you use, whether that's a little comment, a few stars, 5 would be preferable. I would really appreciate it, as it really does help, grow this following, help grow this podcast, help more people kind of hear this message. Anyway, take care, and we'll catch you on the next one.